Hello.
Nice. Yes. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, let's not do NSFW
This will be
stuff
edited
here.
out.
This will be edited out. Okay, so let's actually let's resume. So the audience, if they're listening to this right now, we just said something very scandalous, and it has been edited out, so you'll never know.
But true.
Just yeah. Just live with the suspense, like we live in the suspense about our future. But
Every ICER.
what are we supposed to do? Yes, Chetan. So I have and Santosh. I mean, I think Santosh is also at least looking forward to work in a related area. But what is this business with integrability? Give me like a dumbed down version of what integrability means and why is it important. I've heard a lot about it from you mostly.
Okay, so I am not any expert on integrability because I got very bad grades in classical mechanics and stat mech courses. So, and usually integrability is related to these.
And QFT.
Oh, QFT, don't even talk about it. That was not a course. So, okay, so
Why are we doing this, Santosh? We're not supposed to get any sadder right now, please.
no,
Let me light a cigarette.
I've moved on from QFT. I've
Yes,
moved on from
same.
ICER in some sense. Like it
Yes.
that I have already like it's been a year since we left ICER and my heart has left ICER now. Okay, so
Okay, people who are listening to this, do not get disheartened if you're juniors or if you're looking to do physics, looking forward to do physics or something. This will happen naturally to you, so you do not need to like
Dude,
prematurely take preemptive steps.
the
This will
saddest
just
part is
happen.
that we have, I think, about one batch of people in ICER who have never even visited the campus, and
Right, right.
they are no, they're enrolled in ICER. They have never visited the campus. Dude, I was talking to a junior. I think he's in second year now, and like
Hmm.
they themselves have barely been to the campus. I think one semester. So I like it to them and to me. It seems that they are just like those are the new people in the campus. So I was like just talking to that guy. I asked him how does it feel to be a senior now. He said I don't know because he said that I've never seen my juniors. I don't even know if there are any juniors. So like that's the saddest part.
Time translation symmetry at its best.
We are just stuck in limbo, man. That's the most annoying part. It's like we're not getting anything done, but still we're not perfectly free to
At
do
least
whatever
you
we
are on the
want.
campus. You at least you can relate something. With being
And
at
paying 1,500 worth of fine. Like, what do you mean you're on campus?
no, at least you're physically in the
Everything
campus.
is out
No,
of bounds.
I have forgotten everything about the campus now.
Yeah, but I mean, even if you I think if you remembered, it would be sadder. But like, campus life does not exist. Trust me. I think you're better off at home. Um, we're
That's what I
primarily just stuck in our rooms. The max you can do is maybe go to MDP, get a tea or something, and then yeah,
Has the night
that's about it.
canteen opened?
No.
Oh, then it's sad.
No.
There is no nightlife on the campus if there is no MDP.
There is no life on campus. If you go down right now, the roads will be empty. There's nothing. You'll probably find some dogs, and even the dogs have become lethargic. So
So that's basically
it's
ICER.
just a very dull place to be in right now. Yeah.
Very sad.
Uh,
So yeah, we can in some sense talk about integrability now. Not talk about sad things. And talking about sad things,
distract ourselves from. Yeah. Right.
okay, so I mean, in classical mechanics, we know that there is a there is a geometrical description of classical mechanics, and that sort of includes so suppose we have n particles in our system, classical mechanics. We can define something called as a phase space, which is a set of two n n position and n moment of the particles in your system, and you can so if you want to like say describe the dynamics of your classical system, the entire dynamics of a classical system will be curves in this 2n-dimensional space, this phase space that we are talking about. And in classical mechanics, what we learn is that there exist like some formulations called Hamiltonian or Lagrangian formulations, in which we can use these like this geometrical description to define certain quantities, say called Hamiltonian or say Lagrangian, and doing certain variational approaches to these quantities, we can get the equations of motion of the system, which will describe how the trajectories will evolve in the phase space. Now, the idea of integrability arises here. First, we have to know what integrability means. So, one idea is that all of these equations of motion, or the equations that describe our system, any physical system, these are generally some differential equations. So we have some differential equations, and the solutions to the differential equations are the trajectories or whatever they describe the system. And the point is that if we can find a solution to these differential equations, which means if we can in some sense integrate this differential equations, we can solve for the system. And this is what the idea of integrability is. It means that can you solve for your system, or can you exactly solve for all the quantities that will describe your system. So this is in very rough sense.
So this is integrable in the same sense as, for example, constraints are holonomic or non-holonomic, depending on whether they can be integrated out or not. Is it integrable in the same sense? Like that's.
I don't like. Firstly, I don't even know anything about this holonomic constraint.
No. So some constraints, for example, cannot be integrated into. So when you have a constraint equation like f of q1, q2, blah 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 equal to 0, right. You can either have this, or you can have a constraint equation in terms of differentials. Now, this constraint equation in terms of differentials in general need not be integrable. You cannot reduce it to an equation of the form f of q1, q2, blah 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 equal to 0, and that's what a non-holonomic constraint is. And so these non-holonomic constraints, for example, people don't deal with them in classical mechanics. Right. Because
so one reason why we don't deal with non-holonomic constraints is because it makes the situation chaotic. So essentially, those systems are like they show chaotic dynamics, which means, and like chaos is a signature of the system not being integrable. Like essentially, if your phase-space trajectories are exponentially diverging over time, then it means you like. Let's see what integrability does for us. So we sort of know that any point in a phase space is say it is describing the state of your system at one particular point, and a locus of like if you take a curve on your phase space, it will describe your like say a set of so it will sort of describe the evolution of a system over some bounded time. So if you take 2 points and say one of the points has a time coordinate t1, another one has t2, so the curve that connects these 2 points will describe the evolution of a system from t1 to t2. So essentially, all your dynamics or kinematics of your system, they are described by these curves on your phase space. So the point is that in general, the phase space is like very big, like it's 2n dimensional for n particles. And so if we take any like random curve on your phase space, it's very difficult to analyze the curve. Or essentially what it means is it's very difficult to analyze the system, because any random curve on your, if it's just like a squiggle or something on your phase space, then it doesn't give much information about the system. But the point is that if you have, suppose you have some symmetries in your system, some global symmetries, say time translation symmetry or spatial translation symmetries, with the help of Noether theorem, what we know is that there exist some conserved quantities in the system. And so the existence of these conserved quantities allow us to select a small subspaces of your entire phase space that we have. So for example,
right.
If you have say time translation symmetry, you will have a conserved quantity called Hamiltonian. And what happens is that this Hamiltonian, suppose Hamiltonian essentially is a measure of energy of a system. And so since it's conserved, what it means is that along a particular trajectory, the energy of the system will be conserved. And so instead of looking at the entire phase space, now what you have to look at is a subspace of your entire phase space, and this subspace or this whatever surface or whatever it's called, level curve or something, this
Hmm.
essentially will be denoted by the fixed energy of the system, and this will be a smaller set than the entire phase space. And so instead of looking at the trajectory of the system over the entire phase space, now you just have to consider the small
The
subset of that.
manifold that the Hamiltonian selects. So
Right, the submanifold in the
Right.
entire phase space. And so it
Yeah.
sort of makes studying the system a bit easier. And so this is just the case of a single conserved quantity. But suppose you have a set of various conserved quantities in your system, say spatial translation, time translation, and then some other global symmetries. What it will do is it will like each of these symmetries will sort of constrain your the submanifold that you have to look further. And so finally what you'll end up is a very constrained like say subset of your phase space, and it will be constrained so much that you can essentially use few parameters to describe the entire manifold. So essentially if you suppose you want to describe a sphere, you just need 3 coordinates to describe, or say 2 coordinates if the radius is fixed, to describe the entire sphere, right? You can use an angle and you can use a radius.
Right.
Right. 2 different angles,
Theta and phi.
theta and
Right.
phi. So you can use 2 different angles to describe an entire sphere. So that's the idea, that if you can like instead of having 2n conserved quantities or something, or like this is too much data for any physical system, but instead of all that, so having 2n like having 2n conserved quantities or something means that you essentially know the trajectory, or you know where your system is at each point in time and space and everything. So this is too much data, and you don't even have that for all physical systems. That's not even feasible to have, and it's stupid. So instead of doing all that, what you do is that you require only a few data points or a few parameters that you need to know about the system, say the energy, the momentum, and stuff like that. And you can essentially describe the entire dynamics of your system based on that. So that would be the idea of integrability, that you, instead of looking at the entire phase space, you look at a very small constraint subspace of your phase space, such that it is described only by a few parameters, and then you can exactly solve for your system. You can solve for any physical quantity in your system just on the basis of those parameters. So this is the idea of classical integrability. And I mean, in classical mechanics, we know that there are certain integrable systems like, say, a harmonic oscillator. And I mean, there are some other systems that I think Santosh might know more about than me, which are the sine Gordon. I think if it's called sine Gordon. Uh, what is it called?
Yes, sine Gordon King
Model.
solitons basically.
Right.
Solitons.
So the sine Gordon is a very ubiquitous model. Like it's used in the study of solitons. It's essentially it's very similar to a King solution for your instantons and solitons. So that's another place where it's very useful. Then it's also very useful in the study of these 2D fermion duality, which I think Santosh was talking about last time. That in 2 dimensions you can there is like you can in some sense take 2 fermions and you can construct like you can think of them together as a boson or something. Like there is a duality between fermions and bosons in 2D. Like you can construct a duality like that, and the solutions to that to those kind of differential equations end up being sine Gordon kind of thing. So this sine Gordon is a very ubiquitous model. Also, it's integrable, so in some sense exactly solvable. So another reason why people look at the sine Gordon model. So yeah, I mean, these are the some set of integrable systems that you have, and I think most of the stat mech and condensed matter people spend a lot of time studying them because they give a lot of information. I don't have much idea about that. I think Santosh might talk about it. But one thing that I think we probably might have looked at in our classical mechanics courses, that this looking at the subset of the system that I was talking about, the submanifold, that if you have some conserved quantities, you end up with a constrained submanifold in your interface phase space. And the idea, so there is a theorem called, I think, CAM theorem, Kolmogorov, Arnold, and something.
Moser, if I'm right.
Moser, right.
Yeah, Moser.
Arnold and Moser. These 3 people, I think, they came up with a theorem called CAM theorem, which can be formulated in a lot of different ways. But one way in which it can be thought about is that suppose you have an integrable system. The phase space locus or the submanifold that would be spanned by the trajectories in your integrable system would always be like, it will be something like a torus. It will be an n torus or something, to be precise, but it's always something like a torus. And why, like, this is a very deep theorem, and it's also like there are a lot of topological and very like interesting mathematical ideas that are connected to this. But this is also another idea that's related to integrability, that if your system in the phase space trajectories of your system, if they form some kind of torus, then it turns out that your system might be integrable. So I mean, Santosh, do you have anything to add to, like, from a condensed matter or chemistry perspective to this?
From a chemistry perspective, no, definitely not at all. From a condensed matter thing, not really much. Like, you summarized all the main things pretty well. There is actually, the way I have been studying integrable systems is a little bit different. So how I'm dealing with it is, okay, suppose I consider a lattice theory, and now with the way I'm going to construct this, the way I study this lattice theory is I write down the transfer matrix. Now, for just this one specific Hamiltonian, I find that it's actually tough to solve for its eigenvectors and eigenvalues and so on. And so what people do is they realize that this transfer matrix can be generalized to a whole class of transfer matrices, and each of these are labeled by parameter, say lambda. And now if lambda is continuous, this specially constructed set of transfer matrices is so that these transfer matrices commute for different values of lambda. And later what we do is we say that the Hamiltonian is the logarithmic derivative of the transfer matrix with respect to lambda. And now what we have is that since these transfer matrices all commute with each other, all higher derivatives of the transfer matrix with respect to lambda all commute among each other at different places. And this leads to an infinite series of conserved quantities, because the Hamiltonian is the first derivative, every other higher derivative commutes among with each other and the Hamiltonian. And hence you have an infinite sort of ladder or a series of conserved quantities. And this is the, I don't know, a signature in some ways of integrability. This
Right.
makes
So
a more yeah.
The thing is that what I was talking about was classical integrability. So like there are other notions of integrability. One is that one is that what is classical integrability for, say, field theories. So essentially the systems that I was talking about were like very basic classical mechanical systems, like harmonic oscillator, sine Gordon and all. But suppose you are dealing with, say, field theories. So what will be the analog of classical integrability for field theories? Now the point is that in field theories you do not have this idea of 2n dimensional phase space, right? Your phase space is, you like, if you suppose if your field theory is a quantum field theory, then instead of having a phase space you have an infinite dimensional Hilbert space, and something similar to that in case of a classical field. Like instead of having a Hilbert space, but you have some infinite dimensional space on which your solutions are described. So the point is that in a classical system, you required only a finite number of conserved quantities to exactly solve for your system or to have an integrable system. But for a field theory, say even a classical field theory, you require an infinite number of conserved quantities for the system to be integrable. And this is related to, like, the reason why you required an infinite number of conserved charges for your integrable systems was because you were talking about classical or a field theory. Essentially whatever systems that you're dealing with are some field theoretic system, if I'm not very wrong. And
so I mean, essentially, because each point has now a classical degree of freedom associated with it, each
right.
point in space-time.
And also, so another idea is that like something that's very overlooked in classical field theory discussions is that so like most people get confused why, say, in classical mechanics we were always talking about finite dimensional space of solutions, say a 2n dimensional phase space. So one thing is that most people before studying quantum mechanics, they do not have a good background in classical mechanics. So for them quantum mechanics seems like totally a weird concept, why we require an infinite dimensional Hilbert space. One thing, like, firstly, most people don't even realize that they need an infinite dimensional Hilbert space, because most quantum mechanics textbooks just say you need a Hilbert space of states and then whatever, some blah blah, bras and cats, especially bras and stuff like that. But uh, what most people don't realize is that if you say like study a classical field theory, you realize that having an infinite dimensional space is not a, like it's not something that's uniquely a signature of a quantum system or something, because even a, say a classic, you have a classical field theory, suppose you are dealing with some wave equation or something, a classical wave. So the solutions to this wave equation, like some kind of D'Alembert solutions or something. But what is generically true is that you can expand those solutions in some Fourier series, even if your wave is not like a, say, exactly the 5 box 5 kind of thing. So if it's not just a non-interacting wave, if it's a weird solution but something like a wave solution, what you realize is that you will be able to solve for a system if you expand your wave function, say in a Fourier series, and then there exists a straightforward solution, some Green's functions that you can find to solve for a system. So the point is that having a like existence of this Fourier basis for a system essentially is an indicator that you have an infinite dimensional space on which you are like expanding your solutions, because the Fourier basis is an infinite dimensional basis. Like essentially what it means is that you have an infinite dimensional space on which you are rating all your solutions as a linear combination of those things. So that's why this having an infinite dimensional space is like something that's very emphasized in quantum mechanical systems, but people don't even care about in classical systems. And so that's the thing, like in for a, even for a classical integrable system, having an infinite number of conserved quantities is like usually in quantum integrability people talk about that you need an infinite number of conserved charges. But even in classical integrability for field theories, you require an infinite number of conserved charges, because essentially that's the idea. Like as Amartya was saying, that at each point you have a classical system. At each point in your for your field, you have your field is defined, and so you have a classical system with infinite number of degrees of freedom for your solutions, and so you require infinite number of conserved charges. But another thing is that these conserved charges that you have, they should be globally defined. That's like a subtle idea here, that they just like they need not just be locally defined, because locally I don't know how to say this in a good way, but essentially locally your like every system is in some sense integrable. So there is like it's not a very
Maybe as I mean, I'm pretty sure what I'm saying is very naive, but is it something like if your theory has a, for example, by local symmetry, let's think of something like a gauge symmetry, then there is a trivially conserved current if your theory has a gauge symmetry. So there is no deep conservation law here or no symmetry here. It's just
but what
like,
is
for
the
example, if
trivially
you just have
conserved current?
Maxwell theory, then
No, so
it's
but
the current that your gauge boson couples to.
right, but okay, so
Like if you have Maxwell's theory coupled to some current, then the current is trivially conserved.
but
That
one
just
thing is
follows from the structure of the field tensor.
I don't know of any example where you have a locally like a local symmetry but not a global symmetry. So that's why I was not talking about a symmetry. That's why I was saying that you can locally have an integrable, like a system can be locally integrable but not globally. Uh, because like see, if you have a local symmetry, then I don't think it's uh, like, is it possible that you have a symmetry that's local symmetry for a system but not a global symmetry? I'm not sure. Like I don't think that should be possible, right?
Yeah, that's probably not possible. Yeah, the reverse is true. I mean, that the reverse is precisely the 't Hooft anomalies. You have a global
Exactly.
symmetry, and once you gauge it, it becomes an anomaly.
Right, right.
But yeah, the converse is probably not true at all.
Exactly. So that's why, like, I did not talk about symmetry, but another thing is that if you have, like, suppose if you have a lot of global symmetry in your system, then that's another, I mean, another indicator that your system might be integrable. That a lot of global symmetries in your system means you will have a lot of conserved charges, these no ether charges, and you will be able to construct a lot of conserved quantities that are related to these. And usually, systems that have a lot of global symmetries end up being integrable. I think we, in one of those episodes, we have discussed something about, say, dimensional reduction. Did we discuss it?
Right.
So, okay, so dimensional reduction is an interesting idea, and why it's related to integrability, I'll probably talk about in 5 minutes. So we'll take an example here, which is I think one of the first examples of dimension reduction, which was constructed by Kaluza and Klein. So what they started was with say an Einstein kind of gravitational theory, but in 5 dimensions. So they take Einstein field equations, write it in a 5 dimensional space instead of a 4 dimensional space, and now start looking at the solutions to these Einstein field equations. The idea behind Kaluza and Klein's approach was that so essentially, what would a 4 dimensional observer see if they had this particular system, this Einstein theory in 5 dimensions? Like you have Einstein theory in 5 dimensions, but what would a 4 dimensional observer see if like they were faced with this situation, right? So what a
Right.
like essentially what a 4 dimensional observer would be the components of these tensor fields that just run over the 4 dimensions of which he can see, but they'll not be able to see the extra dimension or anything, any dynamics that happen in the extra dimension. So for
No,
them,
they will be able to see the extra dimension, but it will come from scattering process of other particles that are produced by compactors.
exactly, so they won't be able to see the dynamics in the extra dimension, but whatever happens in the other dimensions, it will appear like so. Okay, the what I'm trying to
Right.
describe is
We get it. Yeah. The
So
extra
basically,
particles produced.
there is a theory in 5 dimensions, and we see an effective theory in 4 dimensions. Yes.
Right.
Right, but what exactly is this effective theory? So suppose you have a metric tensor in 5 dimensions. Now for the observer in 4 dimensions, so this is a metric tensor in 5 dimensions, so it's say a 5x5 matrix. Now for a 4 dimensional observer, they'll be able to in some sense see the 4x4 subspace of this 5x5 matrix, but the rest
Right.
of the components of this metric tensor that are say uh, uh, that run across a fifth dimension, so say a g 05 or something, g I5 or
Right.
g15
Right.
g25, all or 4, I should say, if we consider starting from 0. So the point is that all these components will appear to the observer as vectorial components, right? Because
Right.
like g mu nu is supposed to be a tensor field, but the second coordinate, the second coordinate is fixed to be a 5, and the observer will not be able to see any dynamics in the along the fifth dimension. So for that
Right.
observer, this particular like one of the components is essentially fixed. So for that observer, two crust or a two tensor field will essentially appear to be a vectorial field kind of thing. And
Right.
one component left, which is the G55 or the G44, and that
That will be a scalar.
that will appear as a scalar. So essentially,
Yeah.
the point is that the observer will not be able to see dynamics in the extra dimensions, and those will appear to them as some kind of scalar kind of thing. So what Kaluza and Klein realized was that having a 5-dimensional theory of gravity essentially, so that is described by two tensor fields, it essentially breaks down into a theory of like spin to particles or gravity plus a vectorial component, which essentially amounts to being a U1 gauge field or electromagnetism and some scalar kind of particles. So this was the idea behind Kaluza Klein and their approach to unification of gravity and electromagnetism. But this is an interesting idea because Kaluza Klein just considered a 5-dimensional space, and they ended up with some scalar and vector particles. But we can, in some sense, like increase the number of dimensions, and essentially, if we look at the effective theory in 4 dimensions that correspond to other higher dimensional theories, what we'll get are some like other weird variants of your theory, that those which have extra scalars and vectors. Now, the reason I'm talking about dimension reduction here is because there is a conjecture by Michael Atiyah which says that all integrable theories in D less than 3, all integrable theories, they essentially are dimension reductions of some very special theories in D equal to 4, which are known as self-dual Yang-Mills. So if you have some self-dual Yang-Mills in 4 dimensions, you can in some sense dimensionally reduce these equations to your favorite dimension, and you will end up with all the integrable systems in those dimensions. So say you want to describe some integrable system in one dimension, say sine Gordon or something. What you'll realize is that there exists a way of writing this sine Gordon equation such that you will be able to see that it's a dimension reduction of self-dual angles, 2D equal to 1. And similarly, if you have a two-dimensional integrable system, say some West-Zumino model in D equal to 2, which is also integrable, you'll realize that it's a dimension reduction of self-dual angles to D equal to 2. So essentially, all integrable systems are just dimension reductions of the self-dual angles equations in D equal to 4. So this is a very interesting conjecture by Michael Atiyah, and it's interesting because self-dual angles are like these are the set of these are very interesting equations because they're related to not just physical things like instantons. So essentially, instanton solutions in your gauge theories are these they are described by these self-dual angles. But not just that, they are very important mathematical tools because they allow us to study topology of surfaces, and there are a lot of very interesting ideas that are related. So another beautiful thing here is that self-dual angles are actually first order equations. Normal equations of motion for Yang mills are second order equations of motion, right? We have del mu f mean equal to 0, or in some other sense it's kind of like a wave equation with a D'Alembert operator. So it's a second order equation of motion, but self-dual
Right.
angles are first order equations of motion, which if you think about what are the other
Aren't these just initial value constraints then?
they can be thought of as constraints, but these actually describe dynamical systems. So initially, when people were looking at these self-dual solutions, initially self-dual they were called self-dual solutions because it was thought to be a constraint on your physical solutions, right? So if you have solutions to your Yang mills, you can have self-dual solutions to your Yang mills. So they were thought to be constraints on your solutions, but later it was realized by Atiyah, Drinfeld, and I think some
Right.
people, ADHM people, they realized that these actually describe physical or dynamical systems, and these are known as the self-dual equations or self-dual Yang mills. And there is also some very interesting work by Chalmers and Siegel here. But the point is that self-dual angles are a set of first order equations and related to regular Yang-Mill solutions. But now the other first order equations of motion that we know are the Dirac equation. So there is a very interesting connection between Dirac equations, which essentially the solutions of it describe spinors, and self-dual Yang-Mill solutions. So the connection here is that self-dual Yang-Mills has got something to do with spinors, and this was realized by I think Hitchin or something. Yeah, I think it was Hitchin who realized that self-dual Yang-Mills has got to do something with spinors because it's a set like it's first order equation. And so what mathematicians find very useful is that if they want to study spinors in various dimensions, say they have some higher dimensional space and they want to study spinors on that, one interesting way of studying that is by looking at self-dual Yang-Mill solutions on that particular dimensional space. So self-dual Yang-Mills is a very beautiful thing, and
This is nice.
the interesting idea is that all the integrable systems are essentially just the dimension reductions of self-dual Yang-Mills.
This is actually pretty fascinating. If it actually turns out to be proved,
I think there's some proof to this. I'm not sure if there exists a like good mathematical proof or something. I think it's of the same nature as ADS-CFT. I mean, you sort of know that it's
Oh,
true.
right.
I think you don't have any proof for that.
Right. I see. It's nice. Become very meta. I will take a diversion and I will okay. I can actually talk about like I can make a few comments about compactification and something called the T-channel pole when it comes to finding bounds on the swampland for quantum gravity.
Okay.
Because compactification is one of okay, so I'm going to the last time we talked about how you don't want like positivity bounds essentially follow from requiring that you don't have superluminal propagation about non-trivial backgrounds. But this question is very meaningless in curved spacetimes because gravitational because very simply put, because the light cones as defined by our metric tensor are like they can change. You can just do a field redefinition and you'll get a different light cone. And so the question of causality here becomes very subtle. In fact, this has been known for a long time. If you, for example, consider, I don't know, QED coupled to gravity, you'll find examples where the photon becomes superluminal and so on. And then there's a lot of debates and paradoxes about causality being violated, but all of this is just, everything has been resolved. It's just that field redefinitions change velocities. What matters is the relative velocity between the gravitational waves propagating and the matter waves propagating. And so the right question to ask is, if the light cone as defined by your gravity as your full metric tensor lies inside or outside the regular Minkowski light cone. And this is a frame invariant, field redefinition invariant kind of question to ask. And this is what matters. Now the problem is, this is the first thing when you talk about deriving constraints on effective quantum gravity interactions, quantum gravity. So it's curved space. These subtleties don't happen for lower spin particles, because at the mathematical level, these positivity bounds follow from the analytic properties of your scattering amplitudes. And these scattering amplitudes usually have like some channels. So as we know from quantum field theory, there's an S channel, there's a U channel, there's a T channel. And the S channel and the U channel don't really change anything about the positivity. You can just subtract them away from your amplitude and consider the subtracted amplitude and still apply positivity bounds. You get a problem with the T channel. So so a general result is that if you have a massless particle of spin J, which mediates some interaction, then the T channel diagram coming from this process will scale as S to the J by T, where T is like your Mandelstam variable, P minus P dash. And now we know that unitarity sort of forces a bound on the amplitudes. So we know that all scattering amplitudes must be polynomially bound. In fact, this is the crucial ingredient that led to the proof of the A theorem by Komargodski and these people. This is called the Froissart bound. Santosh, please, for the love of God, do not correct my pronunciation here. I'm pretty sure it's wrong. But so the Froissart bound basically says that your amplitude, if I want to call my amplitude A, then A by S squared must be 0 in the limit S goes to infinity. So this is an amplitude. So the actual bound goes something as S squared log S or something, but the improved bound is this A by S squared. I'm going to call it the Froissart bound because I don't remember the name of the new guy. But this bound has been super useful in establishing a lot of results. For example, Komargodski's proof of the A theorem followed from this bound, and a lot of spectral positivity flows arguments follow from this bound. The thing is, the T channel diagrams for graviton exchanges completely mess this up. Because if, for example, you have a graviton, like a massless graviton mediating your process, then you have a T channel that goes as S squared by T. Now, 1 by S squared times this is 1 by T, which is not 0 in the limit S goes to infinity. And in fact, there you have a pole here as T goes to 0. Now, this pole is related to, a soft graviton being like a nearly on-shell soft graviton being emitted. Because this is an IR, this is an IR divergence, right? T goes to 0, P approximately P dash. And this is also, by the way, this has nothing to do with gravity as such. This is there even in quantum in QED, for example. In QED, the T channel goes as S by T. Maybe a more familiar language is, if you remember, in QED, Rutherford scattering has a divergence that goes as 1 by theta to the 4. Remember?
Right.
1 by theta to the 4, and this has a divergence as theta goes to 0. Now this theta goes to 0 is the same as T goes to 0. Theta is the relative angle between the momenta. And so if theta goes to 0, then the momenta are along the same line. So this T channel divergence is a very ubiquitous thing. And maybe one day I'll talk about IR safe observables and how Weinberg and company had a very extensive program to deal with these. And that essentially ended with them defining IR safe observables. There are subtleties with gravity because we know that in gravity, there are no local gauge invariant operators. So, but that's a different story. We'll save that for later. I was going to talk about compactification. Now, one very nice way to so when you're trying, so let's say I start with an Einstein-Maxwell gravity, right? So I have my Maxwell's gravity minimally coupled to, like Maxwell's electrodynamics minimally coupled to gravity. And I want to consider corrections to it. And I want to see what kind of corrections I can put in there while still having a safe UV completion of this theory. Santosh can't hear. Chetan, can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Now it's fine. Yeah, now it's fine.
Okay. So where was I? So now so for a massless particle spin J, there is a T channel divergence that goes as S to the J by T. And for J greater than equal to 2, so for spins greater than equal to 2, so this is true for graviton, which is spin 2, this divergence violates the Froissart bound. So you cannot make any positivity arguments from here. Now, one way to make, so in general, you cannot make any arguments about positivity when you have gravitational theories, but you'll see that there's a lot of literature deriving positivity bounds for quantum gravity theory, and all of them just neglect the T-channel pool. They start with a disclaimer that all of our results are valid, assuming that the T-channel pole is neglected, because nobody knows how to deal with the T-channel pole. It's just there. And so in, I think 2019 or 2020, Bellazzini and company had a nice paper where they basically talked about one way to regulate this divergence. So this is the idea, what you do. And this is a very beautiful idea. Let's look at Einstein-Maxwell theory in 4 dimensions. Now, there will be a T-channel pole because of the massless graviton being exchanged. But, and this comes to our rescue, if, for example, we had this theory in 3 dimensions, if we compactified one of the dimensions, then we know that in 3 dimensions, the graviton is not dynamical. In 3 dimensions, there is no propagating graviton. In 3 dimensions, the background geometry is just fixed. Einstein's equations just have a fixed maximally symmetric solution. So the T-channel pole will not exist in a 3-dimensional theory like this. So what they did was they compactified one of the dimensions on a cylinder, and now what happens in 3 dimensions is 2 very nice things happen. Your photon becomes dual to a scalar, right? The precise statement would be to say that the 3-dimensional spin 1 massless group is like trivial. It's a scalar. The little group is trivial. So this is the rigorous statement, but we all know this. I mean, in general, F mu nu is proportional, like A mu is partial mu phi for some phi in 3 dimensions. Now, and the other thing is these asymptotic states, the states which are going to be scattering to be deriving your positivity bounds, will all be bosons. So your math becomes extremely easy. And also your graviton is now no longer dynamical. So there is no massless spin 2 particle mediating any exchange. So as soon as you compactify dimension, the T-channel pole simply vanishes. So now obviously this will not work. For example, if you had a 5-dimensional theory and you compactified it to 4 dimensions, but here it will work. Now from here you will find that if you try to construct positivity bounds for this theory where there is no T-channel pole, then you get a very nice set of positivity bounds. And now if you consider the actual amplitudes of the full 4-dimensional theory, so you add the contributions of the Kaluza-Klein modes, you add the contribution of the graviphoton, you add the contribution of your dilaton, and you consider the full amplitude, right? I mean, once you add all these contributions, you're basically feeling all the extra dimension also. So that's the full 4-dimensional theory. Right. But once you add these contributions, you see that you get the same positivity bounds as you get in the compactified theory, plus exactly the T-channel divergence that you want to get rid of. And so this guesswork that people used to do before to remove the T-channel divergence basically becomes a prescription. And you see that the violation of the Froissart bound is precisely by these Kaluza-Klein modes. Right. And so as soon as you compactify, you have found a controlled way to regulate your T-channel divergence. And so the T-channel divergence gets removed, and now you can freely apply positivity bounds on quantum gravity. And this has led to enormous recent work on studying the swampland of effective field theories of quantum gravity.
Right.
So
this is also interesting because what this construction is motivated by is essentially how string theory was started. So T-channel the divergence of T-channel was the precise thing
right.
Veneziano found when he was looking
right. And then you need a infinite tower of higher spins to resum the divergence.
So either
Yeah.
you need an infinite tower of higher spins, or what you realize is that all those infinite tower of higher spins are essentially just the like
Kaluza-Klein modes.
Kaluza-Klein modes for a string. So that
Yeah.
was what Veneziano realized. And
Right.
essentially what also this finding these positivity bounds using dimension reduction is also very related to string theory idea. I think it might be string theorists who came up with this because
Yeah. I did not want to use string theory because I wanted to talk in an EFT framework, being true to my bread and butter, but
but this is what all these string theorists claim, that
yeah, I know.
their
Yeah.
claim is that all like essentially string theory is correct because it shows that gravity is not like it essentially gives you a way to regulate this divergence in gravity. And essentially what they say is that the exact way to regulate this divergence is the string theory. So essentially if you
Right.
do a compactification of a string theory, this is the only way you can get a UV finite gravity theory. But this is
Right.
also what not like I totally do not agree with this, but this is exactly what I think the Swampland people are trying to find out right now.
Yeah.
Whether
Yeah. The historically, I mean, not famous, but like the standard way to regulate the T-channel massless graviton pole is to add an infinite tower of higher spin operator, like Kaluza-Klein operator.
dude, what are your like? Are you planning to do anything after 5th year? Santosh, what is your plan? You're doing PhD, right?
Don't ask me, dude. You see, if I get a good PhD, I'll probably go for it. But then you see, there are plenty of ways to get a Sasta PhD, and I'm not at all enticed by that.
What is the way?
So-
Tell me.
I don't know.
Do you have to pay someone or what?
I mean,
I
not
think-
that. It's
I think
You see,
at the, I think we don't want to acknowledge that decision will have to be taken by us at some time.
yes.
It's just
yes,
like जब आएगा तो देखेंगे तब तक
I've
ऐसे just
accepted this because I don't want to like.
We'll deal with it the way we deal with our exams. Like
yeah.
when it comes, we'll take care of it.
But in case of exams, you have to give the exam, right? Regardless of whether you are dealing with it or not. But in case of PhD, like no one is forcing you to like whatever.
I hate being given choices, man. I hate freedom in my life. I'm serious.
Oh my god, what has happened to us?
I hate freedom. No, seriously, I hate freedom in my life.
So
If somebody
Santosh,
was
imagine
there
your French Revolution heroes heard you speaking right now.
if they knew what happened to France after the French Revolution, they'd agree with me.
I think this should like this is the part. Santosh is like these quotes by Santosh should be the only thing that should be kept in the podcast. The rest of the podcast is irrelevant. I don't know why we do this. Just the Santosh saying random stuff. Out of context, Santosh.
Man ki baat.
Man ki baat.
Wo man ki baat hai. But let's see. Let's watch movies. Okay. Bye bye.
Yes. Bye bye people.
Bye bye, people.
Good night.
Take care.